Welcome to episode 1 of Every Doctor Who Ever. Today we're talking about season 1 of classic Doctor Who. If you're following along and you're watching the older classic Doctor Who with me, you'll notice that, of course, as we get into it, this will be very different than modern day Doctor Who. Now, that's, of course, a thing just in general, but especially in the first Doctor's time. What would be one, maybe two episodes modern days is, of course, 4 to 5 episodes in classic Doctor Who for its majority, and it's a little bit longer of a time to get through. Though, mind you, each episode is like 30-40 minutes, but still, it's a little bit longer to get through these storylines, especially in this time, where ultimately stories can go even longer. Now, also as mentioned, the first Doctor's time has several stories that just don't exist anymore, just as they initially were, so thanks to people finding these differing tapes, we now have them out there. Now, of course, I'll be talking about all of Season 1, so if you haven't already watched it, go ahead and do so. Watch all of Season 1 before continuing. There's some pretty good stories here, some of which not so much, but let's get into them. Before we get into it, let's get into a little bit of background. Let's talk about the beginnings of Doctor Who. When BBC controller of programs Donald Baverstock alerted Sidney Newman of the need for a program to bridge the gap between the sports showcase, grandstand, and pop music program Jukebox Jury on Saturday evenings, he immediately decided that a science fiction show may be the perfect way to bridge that gap. And as well as gaining a family audience. BBC was much more of like a prim and posh kind of thing. I mean, it is Britainland, so what'd you expect? The, of course, initial idea by Donald Wilson and C.E. Weber was, of course, made by Newman as this weird, strange, mysterious man known as the Doctor, who, thankfully, even after certain changes on the initial concept, would remain the heart of the general program. Sidney Newman then initially approached Don Taylor and then Sean Sutton to produce it, though both had declined. Fucking idiot. Which sounds dumb, but then again, this is the 60s, and sci-fi wasn't really, as respected at the time, so yeah. Of course, thankfully though, Verity Lambert, the youngest and only female producer at the BBC, was ready to help produce it. Because she was a woman, there was lots of doubts about her skill and her ability to, do anything in general. But not only would Verity Lambert be the very reason we have Doctor Who at all, but also she's behind several great stuff just made by BBC in general. Keep in mind, Lambert and Newman didn't fully get along all the time, especially due to the fact that, of course, the initial concept was to make it not necessarily educational, as though I've been told that and read that various times. I have no genuine proof that it was meant to be fully educational. I don't think it was supposed to be like a show for kids to really learn things, but more like an after-school program that maybe, parents or teachers would show to their kids in order to get like a little bit of an idea, that sort of thing. But because it was sci-fi and involved time travel and such, weird ideas were initially put on there. Sidney Newman would be around for this beginning era of Doctor Who, but will take a little bit more of a hands-on approach as the franchise would go on. The three major players in this classic Doctor Who era are Verity Lambert, her associate producer Mervyn Pinfield, and the main story editor David Whittaker. David Whittaker is very important in this early classic Doctor Who period because he is the reason why things kind of just actually stuck together and didn't go off the rails, even though people really wanted them to do so. Now, a few notes on this early days is, of course, it is filled with various just mistakes, right? Lots of things were made with one take. Editing was not as great as it was. Could you imagine if I kept in all my mistakes? That would be awful, wouldn't it, right? But as someone who's gotten better at editing and has this editor of like modern day, decades, nearly a century later, it's a lot easier to produce things, right? Now, this was back in the day where we didn't have that. There was the ability to edit things, but it wasn't as good as we have it nowadays. So some things are just left in, certain stage mistakes, certain just weird looking things, and I'll certainly point them out. A bunch of them do in fact come from the main actor who was chosen, and of course being William Hartnell, who was chosen from his previous work. He is a thespian of many sorts. He's been in many things by the BBC. A lot of them are really great, and I'll certainly be making a whole video about his other roles. But mind you, he of course is strangely most well known from being the Doctor, right? This is really where everyone began to know his face, because almost immediately was Doctor Who pretty successful. But it wasn't given that big of a budget when it started, so of course, you kind of just had to do it, and people sort of just flew on the seat of their pants, and that's how the show was made for a little bit. and by a little bit I mean forever. So the set to the TARDIS is the one that will be used for basically the entirety of the first, like, 6 years of Doctor Who. What is basically like two walls next to each other and a weird thing they put in the middle. And that's the set. You can see by the semi-documentary movie that indeed it was a very small set, actually, right? It really was just the walls and the door and the console, right? This thing that could be moved out of the way because, hell, the stage that they were using was basically the same stage they would use for everything. The TARDIS interior, as it was when it first started, is a pretty nice one, right? I love the classic interior. The roundels, as they are called, are something that is just genuinely iconic, and it just really feels more natural in its simplicity, as it just feels this weird 60s sci-fi vibe, right? Of, why is that there? I don't know. It's space alien time travel technology. Doesn't need to make sense. We wouldn't understand with our Earth minds in the 60s in Britain. We're too busy being shitty to the Irish. Mind you, this original one isn't my favorite TARDIS, certainly not my least favorite, but it's not my favorite one, right? That will be later on, but I do want to make it a big point in this video to really mention it and look at different parts of it. We do see different rooms that I'll certainly talk about later, but at least in this season we see a couple rooms, especially later on, where there's just like a chill out room. I don't know where this connects. All things considered, I'm pretty sure one of these walls, mostly the faker looking one, is an actual in-universe fake wall that moves out of the way to reveal a door to these other rooms. That is my headcanon, at least. Mostly because when they move to a different room, it's the same walls and they happen to be open now. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, you do see other rooms in it. There's a little chill room. There's like a room where they could just make food. They have a friggin' like Star Trek styled food maker, right? You can just, there's just a friggin' food replicator in there. And it's almost never a thing ever again. It's only in this season, right? In one story in this season that we get this thing. Though I should say it is mentioned a few times, but still, it's like, well, we can just have whatever we want whenever? What is this? That's crazy. The TARDIS got a lot of weird gadgets in it. Speaking of which, there is, of course, the TARDIS console. For those who don't already know, the TARDIS is, of course, a big time-traveling machine, which, of course, is bigger on the inside than it is the outside, and though it can have differing things that it can look like depending on where it lands, well, at least it should, it, starting in this season, the very first episode, is mentioned to be basically all messed up, and it never gets changed. Mind you, technically the second episode, but really in the first episode, the TARDIS, as we know it, is shown to be a 1960s police box. I could go on the history of police boxes, but that'd be boring, so I won't do that. Either way, the police box is a thing that is still used, right? Not as often, right? But because of that, the TARDIS, that design became known for that, right? And eventually, though some police boxes are still colored like this, because what's stopping them, this is actually something that is copyrighted by the BBC, which is very interesting to me. But yeah, this was a real thing that was used, and that's why it looks like this in the 60s, but because of this broken chameleon circuit, it now looks like that forever. Mind you, it can be apparently easily fixed, of which it is a few times in this series, but the TARDIS, besides a couple episodes in this whole franchise, will always look like that. But again, will look very different over time in terms of its internal, but will always be a much bigger looking area with, of course, a big weird looking thing in the middle. The console will have various looks, and this first look is just okay, right? It's got the right bits and bobs and knobs and such, which is, you know, pretty typical sci-fi stuff. What does any of this do? I don't know. And it's clear neither did anyone who pretends to use the TARDIS. It's mostly William Hartnell as the first Doctor, just sort of presses buttons, he puts his hands on the, like, indicators, and you're just like, does that do anything? Is that your start button? What is this? In this season, we, of course, majorly have 3 companions. This is the way this show will go on for a little bit before kind of settling on him and either 1 or 2, but 3 companions. It, of course, is him, Susan. Susan, who indeed is his granddaughter. They never fully explain his familiar relations. That is something that as we went on for decades and we have not fully understand how exactly he had kids, when he had kids, who his kids are, She's played by Carol Ann Ford, who is just beginning her career and will have lots of roles on in the future. We have Ian Chesterton, played by William Russell, who, when I say Chesterton, because I swear to God, because it is a thing that William Hartnell did so much that they just wrote it into the character. I'm just gonna go with it, so keep that in mind, comments, shut up. And Barbara Wright, played by Jacqueline Hill. Both of them are the teachers of Susan Foreman, as she, of course, is going to school in the modern-day Earth, though after she acts very weird and mentioning future things, which weirdly, how does she know what the actual future is going to be? Because some of it ends up being actually correct, so that's odd. But indeed, she, knowing these future things, gets these two teachers just to follow her home. It's a little bit weird, but okay. And they, of course, find the fact that she's living in a junkyard and there's a weird old man there, and they're like, hey, where's the girl? Show us the girl. Where'd you put her, old man? Did you murder her? Is she in this box? And they of course, force their way into the Tardis, soon finding it to be this big-ass thing. Now, mind you, of course, before we even talk about the first story where this leads, there is, in fact, a whole pilot episode, which is the exact same thing as the first episode, plot and all, but Susan is acting very like clear, cheesy, like 60s sci-fi alien woman, where she's not really showing any emotions and she's trying to be a little bit spooky, and it is so different from her like later just regular, very human feeling performance, and I'm like, God, thank the Lord they didn't like keep going with that version of the character. You can find it online very easily, right? Of just the first episode as it was in the original pilot, right? And it is bad. It is actively bad, right? Because this guy is a grump in general. Like, William Hartnell's Doctor is going to be a bit of a grump in his whole tenure as the Doctor, but especially in this part of it. Like, good Lord. But indeed, the first episode, as it actually is, has the Doctor being like, well, you gotta come with us. And then they go somewhere else. In the second episode of the original first story, just known as An Unearthly Child, also known as 100,000 BC, the Tribe of Gum, and the Firemakers, and sometimes the Caveman, ran from November 23rd to the 14th of December in 1963, is only most notable for its first episode, that being the actual reason why it's named An Unearthly Child. At this point in the series, each of the episodes themselves had titles, which is so odd, mind you, but that they'll eventually stop doing that, like mid-Fourth Doctor, so yeah. This is the reason why this is called that, because this is the most notable episode of the franchise for it being the introductory one, so why not call the whole story that, I guess, right? Mind you, some people refer to the Unearthly Child being the Doctor, but the Unearthly Child, it's talking about Susan, because she's weird, right? She's a weird girl. She's a weird teen girl who these teachers are very concerned about, and now they're brought back to friggin' caveman time, and that's the plot, right? Because every other story is about the actual thing that's going on, so why not call it The Cavemen? Or The Cave of the Doctor, or some shit like that. Honestly, here's the thing I'll tell you right now, okay? Everything I'm gonna talk about, like, here-ish in the runtime, because, yeah, get rid of it, right? Because the first episode is the only one you gotta watch, right? If you want to get into classic Doctor Who, you watch that episode, and you move on to the Daleks, right? This story sucks. It is a surprise that we even kept making episodes after this story, right? The Unearthly Child, or The Caveman, is one of the worst stories. Honestly, I cannot stand it at all. I'm telling you. It's clear they had no idea what they were doing with this series, and I can't fault it that much for being the first story ever, and they weren't sure what they wanted to do. And now, time travel, the first thing you're gonna do is go to caveman times, right? So, yeah. But, like, come on. The series in general will really be at fault for the fact that it takes too long with these stories. All of the classic Doctor Who didn't need to be 4 or 5 episodes, right? But at the very least, this one, the most, did not need to. Here's what happens in An Unearthly Child, or really, The Caveman Unga Bunga. After getting brought back in time, Ian's like, whoa, this is weird, where are we? We can't be so back in time. And then they find the cavemen, who are part of the Tribe of Gum, something that is only really mentioned by, like, production stuff and like books and stuff, because they're just cavemen in this. The tribe apparently invented fire, and their original leader, Gore, is dead, and he invented fire. So his son, Za, has to look to find a way to make fire, which his father never told him. Why did he do that? The tribe is now mostly looking to leadership from Cal, an outsider of the tribe who had been taken in, and is kind of wishing to take over. Cal sees the doctor smoking, because by the way, the first doctor smokes a pipe in this story only, unless I'm wrong. Just put that on the screen if I'm wrong. If I'm right, it's probably because he got attacked by friggin' cavemen and maybe he shouldn't smoke. Cal starts trying to get them to make fire, so Za's mom just tries to kill them. Thankfully, they aren't murdered by a friggin' cave woman back in time. Otherwise, that would be terrible. We'd probably get some cavemen using the Tardis now. They're able to escape, and Cal basically kills her and blames it on the group. The cavemen go and try to find them, and they are very quickly able to prove their innocence. And Za's like, great, not gonna let you go though, make me fire. So then they have to make fire for the guy, and Ian Chesterton canonically teaches cavemen how to make fire. This distracts them, and they're able to leave. And there's your plot, right? It's not that great of a story. It was written by Aubrey Coburn, who had written several BBC dramas in the 60s and 70s, and directed by Waris Hussain, born in India but raised in London, the person who is in fact responsible for casting Hartnell as the Doctor. The first story originally was going to be a story we'll see in season 2, that being The Giants, but that was rejected, mostly because why start a time travel show with them being shrunken down? The only real most notable thing about this story is the fact that it was, of course, the first episode of it, again, the best one, and the only one really worth watching, was shown several minutes late due to some news about the assassination of JFK, right? Now, mind you, there's some, people make a bigger deal about that than it actually is. It's just a couple minutes late. So that's all it was. It was a couple minutes late. They didn't, cancel it and fucking make it go the next week, right? It's a couple minutes late. The first ever story did have, that messy of a production, but certainly didn't have the best production. They had, real actual bones in there and some very itchy costumes. It was not fun to film the thing, and I'm very surprised anyone even kept going after that, and I'm surprised BBC went, oh yeah, we're gonna air that and also keep making more. As mentioned, you could easily just skip over the rest of the story and go right to the Daleks, especially considering where they start at the Daleks is pretty similar to the Wasteland in the Caveman time, so, just do it. But let's be honest here, besides hearing about how much the first story sucks, you're really here to talk about how much the second story kicks ass. This is The Daleks, written by Terry Nation, the guy who also kind of owns the Daleks. Due to the fact that they didn't know what they were doing and didn't realize how successful these weird salt shakers with plungers on their hands would look and would be as successful as they would be, Terry Nation owns half the rights to the Daleks because that's just how things worked back then. Due to that, the Daleks constantly get brought back with Terry Nation mostly being the writer or someone who basically has to approve the story if it happens, him or his estate later on as this franchise goes. That's right, this is where the Daleks begin, and it's especially where the Doctor Who franchise really begins, right? Because in general, the Daleks helped make Doctor Who, alright? The first story is nothing worth really talking about or getting into, because it's not really much happening in it, right? It's cavemen are angry, how do we leave, right? And when the characters aren't having fun, I'm not having fun. And so you better give me some cool-ass monsters, and that's what the Daleks are. Even back here, the Daleks are so incredibly entertaining and, genuine on the fact that they're actually kind of terrifying, right? Whether you want to really see them as this meant of representing this absolute evil of warrant destruction, or do you just like them because they're crazy, shouty robots with weird mutant creatures inside them, then, the Daleks are here for you. They're awesome. Directed by Richard Martin and Christopher Barry, depending on which episode we're talking about, the Daleks came together, mostly as Terry Nation's baby, in terms of what weird, strange world that he can get the Doctor on. As mentioned, there will be some back and forth between our main producers on how exactly to go about this show, so indeed, Verity Lambert really didn't like the idea of, quote, bug-eyed monsters, a very typical term in Britain, or just in general of the world in the 60s, to represent, the very general, typical sci-fi monster alien kind of thing. And that's understandable, 60s sci-fi looks cheap as shit, and it looked cheap as shit even back then. Let's not pretend to look at it and be like, oh, that was the best effects back in the day, because it wasn't. Right? This was bad effects back then, too. But the Daleks were much more than that. They did the best they possibly could to make something that was terrifying and otherworldly and fucking iconic. And what else could you do but the Daleks? Obviously, the Daleks were immensely successful on their first appearance, and that's the reason why basically they would make appearances constantly over every season over the next forever, right? For those who don't already know, the Daleks come from the planet Skaro, and the only other people that exist there are the Thals and the Khalids. The Khalids who, of course, led this destructive, tyrannical war against the Thals, initially destroying the world, with the Thals being the only real sentient life still alive, with the Khalids now being forced to live in these weird mutant shells because that's basically what remains of them. And we'll get more into the origins later, but they do mention that offhand in this one, with us really coming to Skaro many centuries after this aftermath, and now with us seeing the Thals trying their best to live in this destroyed, mutated, petrified world. The group coming out seeing this weird, strange dinosaur thing, which of course is actively, like, petrified in, like, metal, which looks weird. Now, the group basically immediately wants to leave, but the Doctor, this cheeky old man that he is, just like, we need some mercury for the TARDIS. That's how he laughs, by the way. He's great, and we love him. And his weird, strange, trickster ways of lying to the group so they could go on that weird-looking metal city in the background. This goofy man is the reason why the group nearly dies, as they find themselves, of course, immediately being attacked by, of course, the evil salt shakers and all the Daleks. This being their first appearance, we don't immediately have that their ray gun will instantly kill you and there's nothing that they can do. So, due to that, they introduce this thing which is always a thing and will always be a thing that they can in fact do, which is just stun you. They have a stun setting on their Dalek ray. They do that to Ian, who basically flops around for a bit, which of course now allows the group to be shoved into a room. The Daleks quite aren't sure what they want to do with them, but they are interested in seeing why exactly there are people out there. They of course do send them out there to find this anti-radiation gloves, drugs, that were in this weird, strange box that they found once they left the TARDIS initially. Seeing that one of them's paralyzed and the other two are starting to get a little bit loopy from the constant radiation that's in the atmosphere, they send Susan. There she meets Aladon. That's right, Aladon of the Thals, who basically reveals that he is the guy that gave them the weird box, and of course is part of this group of hunky hippies, and that they're here to make a peace treaty with the Daleks. Of course, Susan, after bringing the radiation drugs for the group, then basically tells the Daleks this, who try to take advantage of that. It is here where the group figures out that the Daleks, at least in their city, move around using static electricity, so they of course use a jacket that Aladon happened to give Susan to trap a Dalek and actually use its shell to try and get out. Weirdly enough, it doesn't work very well, so they are nearly caught and do have to escape. It's only really thanks to the Thals showing up at that point that the two groups are able to escape at all. If it weren't for one trying to escape, the Thals probably would have been absolutely obliterated. And if it weren't for the Thals showing up, the group probably would have been absolutely obliterated. So, hey, that works out. It's due to this that they become allies and realize that they have to go back in there because though the Doctor did need mercury for the fluid link, he did bring it with him and lose it in the city. Oops. The Doctor very quickly sees that our group of hunky hippies don't want to fight, so him and Ian basically threaten one of the women, which gets Ian punched in the face. Because if it isn't clear enough yet, which the Doctor and the whole franchise will make it very clear, if you're not fighting and killing people, then you're not a real civilized society. It's time for the first time to teach the natives war like a true civilized society. Unless they're able to get the Thals against the Daleks, which after sneaking on in there and messing with their weird things, which makes the Daleks go all loopy, they're able to take down the Daleks. This takes weirdly longer than you would imagine, and also requires the groups to split up. We don't see too much of the Doctor and Susan's part, but we do see Ian and Barbara with some of our hunky hippies nearly, like, dying while trying to traverse some cliffs, which are, of course, shrouded in so much shade that you can barely tell that they're not actually, you know, in any peril. They're thankfully able to stop the Daleks from doing their plan on fully destroying all the Thals by just using another big nuke, and thankfully shutting them down for good. At least it seems so, because obviously the Daleks will be back. Some notable facts of this story are, of course, that the rescue, the first episode of this, is, of course, the first time we see the dematerialization of the TARDIS, right? The whole initial effect that we know nowadays, at least through most of the classic Doctor Who era, was in this one first, which I find very interesting. It was actually a very hard thing to do, but now, you know, anyone could do it, so yeah. The initial design of the Daleks are very strange, and of course were changed for actual understandable budget reasons, as were their weird claw that they were supposed to have, but instead, of course, they were given a little suction cup plunger thing. Honestly, love the plunger, wouldn't have it any other way, but I do like seeing dogs with claws, which will be a thing later on in the show. The lights on the dome were, of course, added to make sure that it was clear that they were speaking in order to make the actual dubbing of them make more sense. I do love the Daleks. It is one of my favorite stories of classic Doctor Who. Just in general, actually, it's this solidly written story which is enjoyable the whole way through, and it uses its low budget in its best degree possible. Like, you forget that this is a low budget 60s show, and you just like watch it and you enjoy the shit out of it, right? I love how weird Skaro looks. I love this idea of this decimated world and these weird mutants that live in these big canisters who just want to obliterate everything else because they're just pure evil. They're pure cartoonish. That's the Daleks to me, and I love the whole story of the Daleks for that, right? Nothing about this thing isn't entertaining. The characters are all understandable. I did joke about, you know, teaching the natives how to kill, which is a thing which is in many Doctor Who stories, but indeed it's an entertaining action-packed story nonetheless that I feel like anyone, even in modern sensibilities, can watch this and still very much enjoy it. If you want to get into classic Doctor Who and you want to get into the Hartnell era, this one is the main recommendation for stories you need to watch. As a Doctor Who fan, the original Daleks is a must-watch. The Daleks were an immediate success because everyone was frightened of them, and this weird British-only thing of kids hiding behind their sofas, like, whatever that means. What does that even mean, hiding behind your sofas? What? Why are we doing that? What do you think they're gonna get her on TV, stupid? Come on. But still, though, the Daleks are understandably, genuinely, like, a menace, right? That's why I love them. Even here, where they have clear limitations and ways to defeat them, I adore them, and I will never not. And this is really where that begins, at least in terms of our franchise here. Plus, it's really where our characters begin to, like, know each other and, like, get to learn about each other. And really begin to grow as characters. If you're not quite sure about them in that first story, the Daleks will begin to really show you how great each of them really can be, even the Doctor, with his limited capacity of, you know, being a much older man, basically. He still is someone that can do quite a lot, and this really goes to show you how much of a brain this guy has, and how clearly he doesn't use brawn. He uses his brain to defeat weird, evil alien things. That being said, I have a clear Dalek bias, so it doesn't matter what, like, the actual story is, I'm gonna tell you to watch it, but even still, this is a must-watch. So, of course, the BBC initially committed to 4 episodes of Doctor Who. Midway through the production, it was up to 13. Of course, with the Daleks only going a certain number of episodes, they did have a little bit left over, with a very tiny budget due to the fact that the Daleks ballooned its budget. Probably the reason why it looks as good as it does. They, you know, had to make something for 2 episodes. And thus you have Edge of Destruction, my least favorite story in this season. I already ragged on the very first one, so you gotta wonder, what is the Edge of Destruction? Certainly it must be good. It, you know, it goes against the complaint of not every story needs to be 4 or 6 episodes, right? No, this story didn't need to be 2 episodes. It didn't need to be 1, alright? You know what happens in this episode? Very simply, Edge of Destruction is really just about the fault indicator not working properly, and thus they didn't realize that the quick return switch wasn't, like, working. It had a loose spring, which is weirdly something that the TARDIS can have. So the TARDIS itself starts trying to find weird ways to help them understand that they have to fix that. What do you mean? Of course something's wrong. I have scissors. Don't run with them, Susan. It is a stupid episode. Two stupid episodes of them really just, like, really complaining and yelling at each other. It's 2 stupid episodes of them complaining and yelling at each other in the TARDIS. It's not enjoyable to me at all, right? these characters don't fully understand each other, and by the end of this storyline, they begin to understand each other and be fine with the fact that they're stuck in this situation, which the Doctor really, begins to relate to them and understand them a bit more. But really, I see that happening as this rest of this season goes on, not in this episode, right? This one is mentioned by a lot of people to be like, well, it's the episode that they begin to, connect, because they go through such a big crazy thing of merely trying to kill each other, and they sort of just get it all out. Sure, I guess, right? That is not incorrect, but guys, because it's the literal lowest budget any Doctor Who thing ever has been made on, right? Of just some pennies and some hope, and what you really expect. This is the filleriest of filler episodes that anything's ever had, straight up. It does at least give those rooms that I mentioned before, and does show that there's more to the TARDIS than that just big-ass room, right? This is actively one of my least favorite stories of all time, right? I don't see this on a lot of, worse stories, but, listen, when I rank these, which I will continue to do so as this series goes forward, it's gonna go really low and will stay there. But weirdly, not the worst story of this season. The rest of the season basically goes like this. We get to the historical, and then some alien stuff, right? And then another historical, and then some alien stuff. And then the last one, which is another historical, right? Being still attempting to be semi-educational, there was the attempt to bring these characters into historical times. Let's talk about the historicals just right now, at least our first two. We'll leave the last storyline for the end, of course. Marco Polo, of course, about Marco Polo, but also then the Aztecs, of course, about the Aztecs. Marco Polo is the one really worth talking about, right? Marco Polo is actually a pretty good story, which unfortunately is left out by the fact that it's the most broken. Again, as mentioned, lots of this footage just doesn't exist anymore, and lots of it was found, but Marco Polo is the most notable victim of this, in the fact that none of it exists, right? It is purely screen caps taken by people and magazines with text on it, and that's how you enjoy it now. And that's unfortunate. Marco Polo, due to this, is given this reputation by a lot of fans as, well, it's actually really good despite this fact. Which, sure, I guess, right? As someone who can appreciate the audio of Doctor Who, though at this time, at the very least, at this part of our marathon, I haven't listened to too much of it, I do enjoy the ability to have Doctor Who stuff without having too much actual visual indication, right? And God knows until they make any of the animated recreations, Marco Polo just kind of exists like this. Yeah, that's it. Images, so yeah. Marco Polo is a pretty okay story. It is not the best story, it's not the worst story, certainly not, but it's not as great as everyone says it is, honestly. The most notable part of this is, of course, they do show up at around the time of Marco Polo, and unfortunately their TARDIS is taken, so they keep having to just get Marco Polo to let them just go back in their box. But he, of course, is bringing the TARDIS as a prize to Kubla Khan, the man he, of course, is meeting and is most notable for meeting, right? There have been many versions of Marco Polo and Kubla Khan in media over the years. Several have been great, several have been bad, but it's a thing which has been said multiple times of this explorer who multiple people have really tried to discredit the very fantastical things that he's talked about in his book. Did meet up with Kubla Khan and did broker up some peace with some other people around the area, and it was probably a pretty neat guy, even if he may have sort of exaggerated lots of things that he had found, right? And without that, we wouldn't have the age of explorers that every British man wants to be, going on a boat, finding new lands, and teaching the natives violence. It's why, your grandpa would, say a bunch of nice things about Davy Crockett, and why, there was a whole chunk of that in, Disneyland, because Walt Disney really liked Davy Crockett, because just dudes in that age in mid-World War I wanted to go back to the nicer times of finding things. All this is to say is that Marco Polo is one of several stories where they go to something new every episode, right? The travel episodes are, here's something new, here's something weird in this episode. The most other major characters in this is the guy who's working with him, who really is there to try to just kill Marco Polo and take all the glory for himself, right? Because he's working for another group who wants to kill Kubla Khan. And that's his plot. He's trying to really just make Marco Polo not trust the Doctor and friends, and does successfully multiple times. Marco Polo is played by Mark Eden, and he actually narrates the entirety of the story. One of the only times where a character who isn't part of the main Tardis crew is a narrator for the show itself. They do make friends with not just Marco Polo, but also a woman named Ping Cho, who's about to be married off to a much older man. The easiest way to describe Marco Polo, the story, without going into too far of depth with it, which I'm not sure I want to do, is them going to place and getting into a little bit of trouble here and there. Mostly Tagana trying to get them in trouble. One episode is the singing sands, where there's a big sandstorm and it makes sounds. That just is actually how it sounds. Which supposedly sounds like people, which, you know, gets people nearly in the middle of it. There's also Barbara looking into what exactly Tagana is doing at this crazy evil eyeball cave, and actually gets caught when she finds out what exactly he's trying to do, of which Marco Polo doesn't listen to them, even after they help him fight some bandits. From what you can glean of the fight scene, it's actually a pretty cool fight scene, if only we could see it. They're actually able to get the key to the TARDIS and nearly escape if it weren't for Susan going back to say bye to Ping Cho. Like, girl, you have a time machine! Go back later! What are you doing? Stupid! But indeed, that gets them caught, and thus they have to go in this thing for 2 more episodes, getting to Kubla Khan, who ends up beating the Doctor in a game of backgammon, of all things. Which, the only reason they get it back is because, oops, Tagana now suddenly reveals himself to be evil, and he's defeated by Marco Polo. And now they're awarded their TARDIS back. Neat? Again, it's a fine story. It's got a likable cast introduced for the story. You know, Marco Polo is actually a pretty likable dude, and it's played by an actually really great actor. And it's one of the first times we get someone who is a notable actor in this story, like, playing a character. This is supposedly Carol Ann Ford's favorite cereal, and according to Hartnell's wife, this is his favorite cereal, but I'm not sure. This one is okay. It's just fine. Listen, I'm not gonna bash the historicals for being not all that interesting, but indeed the reason why, you know, we watch Doctor Who now is to see weird hijinks happen in, like, back in time, you know, and it doesn't need to be evil aliens and stuff, but, like, man, something, dude. Like, pure historicals just aren't my thing. As a guy who loves history, like, adores history and loves learning about it, I don't care about pure historicals in Doctor Who. They are some of the least interesting episodes to me, and that's the reason why these ones are never going to go all that high for me, you know? But it does have its fans, and that is understandable. Marco Polo is a well-written, interesting story that, despite the fact that it looks, again, just like pictures, it is still very entertaining. Also, damn, the clearly, like, obvious evil man who constantly, like, maniacally laughs at them is trusted over the Doctor and their friends. Like, what are we doing, you know? Like, it's not like you already promised Kubla Khan some big gift, you know? Like, it's not like you've texted him and you're like, great, on my way with the box, and you'll be like, where's the box, Marco Polo? What are you doing? And it's not like if, like, the Doctor and friends weren't there that, like, Marco Polo wouldn't have found Tagana's whole plan, you know? He would have still probably fought him, right? But, like, sure, gotta stay there just in case. But it's not like they know that, you know? Whatever. There is no reason why they were even in the past and staying there, and why they weren't just like, hey, if you don't want us here, let us get the box and leave. Like, what do you want from us? Mind you, there is a part in the episode where they do look at it and it's not working properly, so, you know, that's the reason they can't immediately leave, right? But, like, once it's clear that it can work, like, let them leave. What are we doing here? The other historical is, of course, the Aztecs, and the Aztecs can basically be summed up as the mighty goddess, the white woman. What do you have to say to us? You have come from the weird ancient cave that we have under our big pyramid. You must be a god. We trust every word that you say. What must you tell us? And she's like, so do you still do that whole human sacrifice thing? Don't do it. Oh, you must be a false goddess. Only real gods would allow us to continue doing human sacrifice. And she's like, no, don't do human sacrifice. And he's like, you're not real. I don't believe in you. I'm gonna kill this man and then rain will come. And she'll be like, no, don't do that. don't do the rain thing, and you'll be like, rain, and that's how it ends. If they happen to land it anywhere else, none of the plot would have happened. Just saying, it's very lucky that we happen to be in that room, but okay. The Aztecs, I just kind of zone out of for a majority of it. Like, I'm just floating in this, like, void, just roaming around, going back around in a big circle, just barely giving a shit till suddenly a big lightning bolt strikes me. Ow. Like, for real, I tried my hardest to give a shit about the Aztecs, but it's just such a boring story. The Aztecs is the one that people really would point to as one of the least interesting pure historicals, and one of the reasons why these things just don't work, right? Now, mind you, the whole plot of Barbara trying to interrupt this society and the Doctor being like, don't, and then her finding out not only why you shouldn't, but also why you can't, it's an important message, right? You can't change the timeline. You can't mess with these things because it's just, you can't. You can try, and it will cause not only the timeline to get all messed up if you're successful, but you probably can't, right? And it's both a good message of you can't mess with cultures and groups of people who don't believe in what you believe. You can't force them to believe things, right? It just won't work like that. You gotta let those kinds of, you can kind of guide them, but eventually people like that might come to the same idea or not. That's just how the world works. That's how the timeline works. The Aztecs is, I think, at its best when it is in that neat little character moments between the Doctor and Barbara. And if we're talking stories where these characters begin to connect instead of, you know, Edge of Destruction, we're talking the Aztecs. Got cat hair everywhere. Now, you might be asking, what's everyone else doing? Well, I don't remember what Susan's doing. So yeah, that's a thing. But more importantly, what's the Doctor and Ian doing? They're trying to get back into the room where they happen to be, which is like stuck in a pulley system, which nearly gets them killed. And that's kind of funny. In the process, the Doctor meets this woman who straight up just drugs him and marries him with some hot cocoa. And it's weird. And it sounds worse than it actually is, because it's just sort of meant to be funny in the actual episode. There's a great scene where the Doctor reveals that he got married, and like Ian's like, "Your fiancé?" And it's a very funny moment, and like a clear showing of these characters have really grown throughout the season, right? Like, all of them have had their moments throughout this season, especially in this episode. And this is where the show, I think, despite this storyline not being fantastic, this is where the show begins to really get good with its characters, right? When they're together, there's some great moments that are always very entertaining of these enjoyable, likable characters are like, man, what have we gotten ourselves into? Ian is also challenged to fight a dude, which he actually defeats. Like, Ian, who is the coolest dude, because he fights and wins against an Aztec warrior. Like, what? That's insane. What a guy. What a dude. Like, but it's moments like that that really help the Aztecs be a lot less boring than a majority of it really feels like. There are some funny and cool moments throughout it, and the Aztecs is a just okay story, you know? It's not bad. It's definitely not good, though. It's really boring. Now, for two of the weird alien stories. The first one being Key of Marinus. Also written by Terry Nation, has a few directors in it. The Key of Marinus is also another story with multiple things going on in every episode. This introduces the Vord, led by Yartek, who are trying to get to the thing which controls Marinus, and they gotta find the keys to it. The guy who's Arbatan, who's this elderly man who's trying to keep the weird consciousness of Marinus together, asks them to go find them, and he sends them to do so. The Vord then don't show up till the last episode. Neat. The Vord are one of various attempts to try and make a new type of Dalek kind of thing, of which they will fail to do multiple times, till inevitably creating the Cybermen, of which I think canonically the Vord are some faction of Cybermen. I don't know! The first key is in Morphoton, the best episode because of the Morpho. They hypnotize people, they're evil brains, and they're the best thing, and they're our mascot of this series. I love them. They're the best thing. Why have these things not appeared in the years since? Where did they go? They are smashed because Barbara, for some reason, isn't like as easily controlled by them. So that's weird, and they're all probably dead. But like, what are they? I love them. They're so weird brain slugs. Barbara saves everyone from their shitty lives, and through that, they bring some people with them. The second episode is a pyramid filled with evil plants and evil traps, which nearly kill them. This is most notable for the fact that it was, in fact, the reason why the franchise and BBC was slapped with a bit of a lawsuit. Robert Gould complained that Donald Wilson, that the whole storyline of the second episode was stolen from his own story. Mind you, of course, the judge over this court basically went, hey, you know the Triffids? Case dismissed. Mind you, maybe he did take it. I don't know. Listen, evil plants are the most basic evil thing to do, right? Only Ian and Barbara find themselves in this pyramid because Susan and the other people, whose names are pointless, find themselves somewhere else. So it's just them dealing with evil pyramid for a whole episode. Inevitably, they do get teleported to the next area where they find the other people, and they find angry men in cottage who tries to kill them when they try to leave because he's weird and creepy. He, like, breaks the bridge that they go on to find the other key so they can't, like, come back from it. Man, that would suck if the big evil knight armors that are, for some reason, guarding this key come to life. Oh, no! This episode doesn't feel like we did it with a budget of sock. The last episode is probably the worst of them, with them going into just a full kangaroo court. One of the first of several court scenes that involve the Doctor, but strangely enough, one where he's not on trial. Instead, it's Ian, of which them, like, it's like, have you played Phoenix Wright? I'm just like, our society has went to such a way where we go incredibly fast with our court, so unless you find the weirdest ways to prove that not only did they not do it, but someone else did it, then hey, they're getting the chair, baby! Thankfully, the Doctor is the best lawyer of all time, and they're able to get that key and go right on back. They decide to use a fake key that they found and shove it in the key to Marinus right when the Vord tell them to shove all the keys in, which of course makes it explode. Arbitan doesn't like this, but it's actually a good thing, because this also allows everyone to just do whatever they want, right? Apparently, it had something to do with controlling their minds? I don't know. This was very quickly written to replace a story about the Indian Mutiny, a story that probably would have been very weird to make a Doctor Who thing out of. The idea was to make several small adventures to help expedite the process, and you know what? I'm surprised the series didn't go this direction going forward. It probably would have been much easier, and hell, probably would have been easier to talk about it. Like a weird 60s X-Files kind of thing would be very interesting, wouldn't it not be, right? But still, you know, Doctor Who kept going the way it normally was, so now we just have this weird story of multiple smaller bad stories all together. Weirdly, this will also be a season-wide version of this later on in season 16 with the fourth Doctor, also involving a weird magical thing, which involves keys to get shoved in it for some reason. Key Marinus is not a great storyline, but it is funny as shit. It is pure, goofy, wacky, cheesy 60s sci-fi, and if you're looking for not a well-written storyline, but a fun one, and Key Marinus, that one's worth for friggin' watching. Listen, it's not good, it's just really dumb, there's not a lot of great moments, it's got knights in the Antarctic, it doesn't make any sense at all, and probably was just made with barely a thought, let's be honest here. This is probably Terry Nation's worst story he's ever written, because it was just so clearly made without a thought. But despite that, it's a fun story, right? And this is one that if you're watching at least all of season 1 with me, then this is one I don't think you should skip. You know, if you really want to, you can. You know, it's not the best one ever, but it's fun as shit, and I love the Key of Marinus. Keys of Marinus? Keys to Marinus? Brain slug. Alright, so the worst storyline of Doctor Who ever is, you know, not in the first Doctor's era, okay? These early episodes may not be the best ones, but they're not the worst ones. Not even close, right? Some of the worst ones come during the later 4th, some 5th, some 6th, several modern-day storylines. But what I want to say to be one of the worst storylines of all time, guaranteed, which not a lot of people mention, is the fucking Sensorites, dude. Alright, here's the Sensorites. Remember that guy, you know, the couple of times it's happened where they're in a group and this one guy's like, I don't believe you! So he tries to, you know, stop them from just trying to have a good time for an entire story. That's the Sensorites. But at its absolute worst. The Sensorites as the group finds themselves aboard a spaceship who apparently are being harassed by some kind of weird thing. One guy is going absolutely insane, but the TARDIS crew seems to be immune to the Sensorites' power. Due to Susan's psychic powers, they're able to talk to the Sensorites as they attempt to try and, like, keep these humans down and continue to do whatever they were doing with them. Susan, Ian, and the Doctor without Barbara, due to the fact that, you know, her actress was wanting to go on vacation. It's what happened to William Hartnell in Marco Polo, so it's understandable. They go with them to the Sensorite planet, and they find out why the Sensorites are just, like, keeping them there, both not allowing them to go to the Sensorite planet, but also not having them leave, is because apparently humans in the past have messed with them. A, and B, there's something wrong with them that maybe the Doctor and friends can help. There's some reason why they've been getting weaker, and several people have been dying. There's something going on, and for some reason, the one city planner really doesn't want them to do anything at all. He says there's nothing going wrong, that these humans will just make it worse, and due to that, he is the worst villain in the whole franchise. As are the Sensorites. They look like ballsack heads, and I hate them. Why do they have just fully fucking chin beards, right? And they all look awful. They look like the worst looking aliens of the whole franchise. Worse than, yes, that, and that. I hate them with their big, stupid duck feet, which I forgot were a thing until rewatching this story, strangely enough. But mind you, what really makes them bad is the fact that they all look the fucking same, right? Which is something that canonically is a thing, right? Not only just to do the humans think that they look the same, but literally the city planner takes advantage of hearing that, kills one of the other Sensorites, and takes his sash, and then everyone thinks he's the other guy. So they all know that each other look the same. What? And it's just a lot of, like, complaining and yelling at the Doctor and friends for existing, which is just really annoying the whole time. So they can't even do anything. He doesn't let them, like, figure out a way to, like, stop the clear poison that's running through the friggin' sewer system. And they are barely just able to find the reason for it, which, yes, is humans, but humans that they basically have shut down there for the same reason why they were keeping the guys up in space. So it was the Sensorites' fault for driving these guys insane and having them be stuck in the sewers, putting poison in their water. So, you know, the whole thing here is Susan's apparently psychic, the Sensorites suck, and you could have had, like, a whole half of this plot actually being about, like, this weird, like, group of rebellious humans going up against the Sensorites, and them end up being actually the bad guys. Would have been way more interesting than ballsack heads annoying us with their boo 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 boo. So, now for our season finale. It, of course, as mentioned, is a historical, and one of the only times where that is actually the case, where it's just sort of a regular story. The Sensorites was supposed to be the season finale with a bigger hiatus, but they decided to go with Reign of Terror for a little bit of a shorter hiatus in between seasons. Anyway, all this is to say that, once again, the backstory of the story is much more interesting than the actual story. Like Marco Polo, sections of this don't exist, but were reanimated for the 2013 re-release of this story, which of course look very strange. They are the very early animated recreations, so they don't look quite as good as the later ones for several Second Doctor storylines, but they do a pretty good job at really doing their best to attempt to replicate the way the camera worked and the way the scenes actually looked. Here's the plot. They get stuck in not just the French Revolution, which in this storyline is established to be the Doctor's favorite time period. Understandable, it's mine as well. But specifically, the worst part of it, which that means, of course, the best part of it, the Reign of Terror. Thus, the name. Whoa. The Reign of Terror is, of course, well, I don't know. Am I going to talk about the French Revolution? Let's talk about the French Revolution. I could go on for hours, but let's say kings suck. People say, "You suck, king," and he's like, "No, but I could." So they decide to shove him in a room and then take everyone who's corrupt and chop their heads off for a long time. Eventually, Maximilian Robespierre takes advantage of this new system and begins basically almost acting like a full monarch, chopping so many people's heads off until everyone went, "Hey, no." So they chopped his head off. I wanted to take this time to be like, I think a lot of this in general, they do a pretty good job with the looks and the feel of the pure historicals, right? Now, while the actual storylines aren't the most interesting, the way these stories look, I think, are pretty great. They do a very good job in terms of not just how it looks, but also how characters act in terms of how they were historically. John Lucarotti was very inspired by the actual journals of Marco Polo in order to make the whole Marco Polo storyline, and I think he did just as great of a job at representing Aztec culture in the Aztecs. Dennis Spooner did a really great job doing as much research as he could, even to the point of really making Maximilian Robespierre seem like how he was in real life, and really paying attention to the most important details. Robespierre, who is technically the major villain of this, is the guy, behind the various troubles that the Doctors and friends get into during this storyline, but indeed really isn't here till, the last couple episodes, where, of course, he's attacked, nearly shot in the mouth, which presumably happens off-screen, because that's what happened in real life. All this thanks to, of course, by Napoleon Bonaparte, who is, in fact, here, and I don't think you will really get into anything else he did in Doctor Who. But I feel like it's obvious what he does after this story, so... Indeed, they're helped by a counter-revolutionary group, which I feel like should really be the bad guys, but then again, the revolutionary was getting so much out of hand that the counter-revolutionaries became the good guys suddenly. Point is, they get in the middle of the crossfire and constantly go back and forth in this one jail, which is probably the best part of the actual storyline, right? This goofy man is in charge of the jail and constantly gets tricked into letting people go, and you're constantly like, oh you, goofy man, silly man. Besides that, though, this one's actually kind of forgettable, right? Like, you'd think I'd remember it the most, but honestly, I can't remember most about what happens in this story. I feel like it's very much like the Aztecs, though it's great in how it represents the actual time period, and I love how it looks and how the characters act, because it's very accurate. The actual storyline itself is pretty just nothing, right? They get in the middle of the French Revolution, they don't die, and then they leave, and that's the plot, right? It's cool to see some historical characters, that's neat and all, that's it. That's all I can really say about it, right? The Reign of Terror is very much like the Aztecs, so it's a fine story. There's nothing wrong about it, necessarily. They did the best they could with what they were given at the time, and they really had a clear idea of what they wanted to do, and they set out to do it, and they done did it, right? But, it's not the worst season finale, but it's definitely one of the most just not just boring, but also kind of disappointing, right? If it's gonna be this big finale of a season, and it's gonna lead into a hiatus, make it something bigger, right? And yeah, it's the French Revolution, and that's a big, crazy, insane event that happened in history, so it makes sense that that could be something climactic, but it doesn't feel climactic. It doesn't feel like they got involved in it, or they have to help it settle down, or they have to stop Maximilian. It's just, they watch the French Revolution happen. Neat. Cool. Alright. Whatever. With that being said, here's my Season 1 ranking on screen right now. And with that being said, Season 1 of Doctor Who is an okay season, right? It's the initial, beginning of this series. It is its growing pains, and it really shows it throughout it, right? The first season, not fantastic. It really isn't all that great. I am not a big fan of the historicals. The aliens they introduced, besides the Daleks, aren't all that great, and its very first story is actively not good. In fact, several of these stories, beside the Dalek, I could easily recommend to just skip all the way over, right? A lot of the historicals don't do it for most people. I'd say try them out, right? Especially the Aztecs. And if you're going to really go for learning about classic Doctor Who, then none of them really hurt, except the Censorites, which again, we're forgetting exists at all. But indeed, Season 1, not a great season. Not a great introduction to Doctor Who. I would say for anyone who's new to Doctor Who, or at least classic Doctor Who, watch the first episode, skip to the Daleks, move to the next season. The first one is one of the weakest seasons of all of Doctor Who, and even big Doctor Who fans can agree to that. Most of this isn't bad, it's just not all that fantastic. It doesn't do a good job to, really introducing these characters, or giving them much to really do. A lot of dilly-dallying in places that it really feels like, oh, might as well, we got some episodes to fill, I guess. Some of the worst cases of that, and, some of this really feels like it was, again, budget of a sock. But still, though, it does give the beginnings of this wacky, wild, lovable show that is Doctor Who in its classic period. I can't fault most of it. I can't hate most of it, but I still am not the biggest fan of this season. Besides, of course, the lovable, terrifying Daleks, most of this, if you're a new Doctor Who fan, you can skip right over and move on to the much more interesting stuff that we'll get to next time. As next time we talk about Doctor Who, we'll be talking about the second William Hartnell season, Season 2 of Classic Doctor Who. Until then, I've been the Movie-a-thoner. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any other ideas of things that I should talk about, both in terms of Doctor Who, sci-fi stuff, TV shows, movies, and leave that stuff in the comments. Make sure you leave a subscribe, as I'll be doing this every other couple of weeks, not just some Doctor Who, but some other stuff that I have planned, and make sure you share this with everyone to the point where they're like, hey, I thought you didn't like Doctor Who. After all that shit talking about that one season, you're like, no, but I do like Doctor Who, I promise. But most importantly, stay good, stay safe, and don't be an asshole.